The Sting started and ended a genre of its own. After it came out, if you made another movie about a caper, about a big con, well, congratulations. You were making a takeoff on The Sting. If you used The Entertainer, you were making a takeoff on The Sting. If you touched your nose, you were making a takeoff on The Sting. This is a movie that seems like it could never be duplicated. Which brings us to The Sting 2, a 1983 film directed by someone else and starring some other people. Actually, the cast is not bad. Nonetheless, this movie was destined to be a letdown, and it was. It's rated 4.9 on IMDb. But if you actually look at some of the reviews, you'll find some people saying that the movie isn't that bad. Of course, I had to find out for myself. The Sting, the original, the first one, The Sting has a special place in my heart. I think it was the first movie that I ever called my favorite movie. I saw it when I was, I guess, in elementary school, young. We got the DVD in the mail from Netflix, and I was completely taken by the magnetism of the actors, the energy of the film, the ingenuity of the movie, and the ending blew my mind completely. I was just a kid, and I'd never experienced a twist like that before. You can only really experience that once. Even though I was at a particularly impressionable age, I think my reaction to the movie is similar to a lot of other people's. This is a beloved movie. In truth, there are other caper movies out there. David Mamet has made a few, like The Spanish Prisoner or House of Games, but to me, they all kind of feel like an homage to The Sting. Ironically, though, The Sting actually had to contend with a couple of allegations that it was a ripoff. Anyway, The Sting came out in 1973, and The Sting 2, sometimes referred to as The Sting Part 2, but I'm going to call it The Sting 2. I guess I could call it The Sting the Second. Either way, The Sting, I, came out in 1983. It was directed by Jeremy Kagan, not a very well-known director, but he did direct 2 episodes of The West Wing and an episode of Columbo. He also made a movie about Scott Joplin in 1977 called Scott Joplin. Billie D. Williams, a.k.a. Lando Calrissian, played Scott Joplin, who had a fairly grim life. In his day, Joplin was well known, but after his death in 1917, the popularity of ragtime declined, and by the time The Sting came out, the average person might not have known too much about him. I'm usually skeptical of claims about movies popularizing songs. For instance, some people say that the film Ordinary People made Pachelbel's Bell's Canon famous, made it known to mainstream audiences, at least. Or some people say that the movie Waterloo Bridge, great movie, made the song Auld Lang Syne famous in China. Who knows? I think both of these songs were already fairly well known, but maybe not to the average person. I'm not sure. Back then, there was no internet, so maybe it was harder to dig up old stuff. Either way, The Sting 2 uses similar music. Lalo Schifrin put together the score from music by Scott Joplin, and I think he was nominated for an Academy Award for it. Lalo Schifrin, great composer. He wrote the theme to Mission Impossible and Cool Hand Luke, among other things. Anyway, I don't want to spend all day talking about the music. Everybody knows that the film and the score are inseparable. I think it's worth mentioning, though, just how unconventional the score for the original is. The Entertainer is not your typical film music at all. It's kind of relaxed. It's kind of playful. Also slightly melancholy, though. The tone is really interesting. I think it sets the tone for the movie. And I think tone is really an important thing about The Sting. It's a movie with some real emotional intensity, a lot of suspense, a lot of tension, but it's also fun, sly, extremely charismatic. Maybe charismatic is the number one word I would use to describe the movie. Very few films strike a similar balance. The sequel actually does an okay job at replicating this. The Sting 2 has a decent cast. A good cast, I would say. Of course, it doesn't exactly compare to the original, which has one of the most iconic casts of all time. Jackie Gleason stars as Fargo Gondorff. Mac Davis plays Jake Hooker. Mac Davis was mainly a musician. He wrote some songs for Elvis, for instance, like In the Ghetto and A Little Less Conversation, which is the motto of this channel. Anyway, you might be wondering who the heck are Fargo Gondorff and Jake Hooker. In the first film, the characters are named Henry Gondorff and Johnny Hooker. So maybe in the second, these are their relatives or something, but Lonergan is in the sequel as well. He's played by Oliver Reed, and he's trying to get back at Gondorff and Hooker because they stole his money a few years before in Philadelphia. So they're kind of the same guys and kind of different. Note that the original is set in Chicago, not Philadelphia. So the whole thing is a little bit fuzzy from the start, but that maybe isn't too big of a deal once you're actually watching the movie. I don't know. The sequel is set 4 years later, in 1940, and there's a brief mention of the war, but generally the movie feels far less in tune with history than the original. The sequel, mainly takes place in New York. The original opens up in Joliet, Illinois. I've always liked that touch. I think it grounds the movie in America in a certain way. Now, I think the whole thing was filmed in California, and honestly, it sort of shows. I love The Sting, but it has some dodgy matte paintings in it, and the streets kind of look like a Hollywood backlot. Still, it's cool that it opens up in Joliet. Can you name another movie that starts there? The sequel doesn't have this particular nuance. Anyway, we were talking about the cast. Carl Malden is also in The Sting, too. He plays the Mark. Teri Garr is also in the movie, and the cast is rounded out by a pretty good cast of character actors, with the exception of whoever plays Lonergan's goon, Carlos. This is really a weak point of the movie, a huge anachronism, and just, terrible acting. Just really, probably, maybe the worst part of the movie, this character. I don't know. And it's a huge fall, in particular, from Charles Deerkop, who plays Lonergan's goon, Floyd, in the original, and I think that's a phenomenal character. He does a great job. Actually, I think The Sting, the first one, is possibly the greatest cast of ensemble character actors ever assembled. Let me cut to the chase, though, in terms of whether or not The Sting 2 is any good, because I think there's actually much more interesting things to talk about. Obviously, this movie is not as good as the original, obviously, but it isn't awful. The beginning is particularly weak, which is a bit unfortunate because a lot of people who will watch the movie will go into it expecting it to be bad, and the beginning is bad. But it gets better. In general, the movie feels cheap. It feels like a knockoff, but it does capture some of the spirit, some of the charisma, some of the tone is there. A lot of the twists in the sequel are predictable, and they don't ring like the ones in the original did, but there are still some clever ideas in there. For instance, in the sequel, rather than doing the nose signal, Fargo Gondorff takes a picture of him pointing at his nose, and then they mail the picture to different people in their little mob. This is kind of a clever mechanic, I guess. It was only 4 years later. I'm not sure why they would be using a different signal. I mean, it doesn't really make much sense, but it's kind of clever. There are some clever things here. There are some decent lines here and there. I think the best thing about the sequel is probably the acting. There are some weak points. I already mentioned one. Carlos, terrible. I also think Oliver Reed isn't very good, especially compared to Robert Shaw, who is so intense in the original. The one thing I never liked about Robert Shaw's performance is his limp. It seems a bit on the nose or whatever, but apparently it was actually a real injury that Shaw suffered right before filming. Teri Garr is another weak point of the sequel. Maybe later in the movie she gets a little bit better, I guess, but she didn't seem to get the memo that the film is set in 1940. One thing that's cool about the original is how much slang there is in it. I remember when I watched it as a kid, there were several parts I couldn't understand. Words I had never heard people say, like, oh, it's Jake, or something like that. The Sting Part 2 doesn't really do this at all. And like I said, Teri Garr sounds like she's a time traveler from 1983, the distant future. Anyway, I don't want to just complain about the movie. I think there are more interesting things to talk about, but let me complain just a little bit more. I mentioned already that the beginning of the movie is weak. The beginning of the original film is masterful. It has incredible zeal, a perfect opening gambit that might just fool the uninitiated, but that teaches you how to watch the rest of the movie. You watch The Sting a different way from how you watch a lot of movies because you're always trying to guess what the game is. You watch closely. You try to see what the trick is going to be. That's true in the new one as well. Maybe even more so since you know from the beginning how it's going to work. But this is a tough game for a movie to play because it has to stay one step ahead of the audience. And that's not easy, especially for a sequel where the original film already bamboozled everybody. The sequel doesn't really do this. It's not totally predictable, but it's not going to surprise you. The only twists that you might not see coming are the ones that are just a little bit too ridiculous to be able to predict. The ones that don't really make much sense. Like I said, not terrible, though. Anyway, we're trying to talk about the beginning, because I think the beginning of the movie, the difference really, it kind of illustrates exactly what the differences between the movies are and what the shortcomings of the sequel are. In addition to being ingenious, the beginning of The Sting also actually hits pretty hard. If you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. This opening gambit, it actually ends terribly, right? And that's telling. I think that's important in how the film works. Not exactly the case in the sequel, where The Sting opens up on the streets. The Sting 2 opens up inside some fancy nightclub in New York. It has an opening gambit, but it's cheap. It's basically the same switcheroo as in the first movie, but it doesn't have this scrappy feeling to it, for one thing. It's a sort of a high society thing, and it's really predictable, and the acting is bad. So they sort of blow the opening gambit. It doesn't feel ingenious. It doesn't have this zeal to it. It doesn't feel scrappy. The movie then tries to follow that up with an emotional punch, just like in the original, but it falls totally flat. Lonergan assassinates someone called Kid Colors. The first time we meet Kid Colors is when he's about to die. The movie never introduces him. There's no emotional connection. His death isn't dramatic. They simply walk him to a warehouse, and Lonergan says some really cheesy line. If you've seen the original movie, you know how hard it actually hits in the beginning, how much context they add, how well they set up some of the early drama, and how that really defines the entire movie, in fact. The Sting 2 kind of tries to do that, but they don't get it right at all. The Sting 2, it tries to follow the format of the original quite closely, actually. You might be surprised, sort of, how closely they follow the blueprint, but it turns out there's a lot more to a building than just the most basic plans. It lifts some things note for note, but it's a cheap version of everything. And the original is such a finely tuned movie with so much tension and so much charisma. These are subtle things to get right. The sequel, it doesn't. It has maybe about 40% of that. 30%, 20%, I don't know. I mentioned that the sequel borrows all the basic structures. One thing that it doesn't replicate is the chapter titles, which I think is a shame because the chapters in the original are a really cool mechanism, a type of punctuation that beautifully puts a point on one part of the movie and also shifts us forward, moves us forward to the next thing really well. Anyway, I want to talk about some things that I think are some things that stood out to me while watching the second one. I think the thing that I found was most interesting about the sequel were which elements of the original it runs with, which one it really leans into. And I don't mean the structure of the plot. I already kind of talked about that, how it sort of tries to replicate certain things, leaves other things behind. What I mean really is what settings and themes kind of rise to the surface, right? For instance, both movies have gambling at their core. In The Sting, it's horse racing. Actually, when I was in Toronto last year, I stumbled onto an off-track betting parlor. I'd never seen one before. I think it's still legal in most of the US, but it's just sort of fallen out of favor. I didn't go in, for the record. I thought about it, but it felt sort of illegal to go in. It's not. The Sting Part 2 is about boxing, another sport that really isn't what it used to be. Horse racing and boxing feel really similar to me. That's what I'm trying to get at here a little bit, is like both movies have a certain view of something. Both movies, they have scenes on trains. They both feature amusement parks. The original has the carousel, which I think was actually filmed at Santa Monica Pier. The sequel has a bunch of scenes in Coney Island. Roller coaster rides, the Tunnel of Love, bunch of Coney Island stuff. Maybe it's just a look at the entertainment of the time. Maybe it's a nod to the illusion and the trickery that the movie has in store. A theme park and a casino, they sort of have something in common. I can't quite put my finger on what it is, but they're distractions. But there's also risk there. They both have a lot of flashing lights. Entertainment, but an addictive form of blinking entertainment. Reminds me a little bit of our cell phones. Maybe it was the TikTok of the 1930s. That's a pretty boomer thing to say. Let's strike that comment from the record. But yeah, what are these things representing? There's a certain type of Americana in both of these movies that I find interesting. I guess it shouldn't really be any surprise that the two movies have some things in common, especially because the second one is a blatant copy of the first. But what I'm trying to understand here is what makes those particular things the symbols of the time. Why did they choose boxing, for instance? Why was that similar? Why did they say, okay, the things we really need to include are the train rides and the amusement parks? What vision of America is The Sting linked with? I think maybe the most obvious answer is that it's all about the Great Depression, defined by the Great Depression. The Great Depression isn't actually at the center of the original completely, but it's fairly consistently in the background. Nobody makes any money legally in either of these movies. That's kind of interesting. You'd be forgiven for thinking that the good guys are following the law, and I guess it might seem like maybe they're skirting the law, but believe me, the stuff they do, it is illegal. Anyway, this is not your typical sort of capitalist film. It's a movie that is sort of captivated by wealth. We have makeover scenes, for instance, but if anything, the message seems to be that wealth can be faked, that you can outdo a rich person without having any money. That's actually really accentuated in the second film. I mean, in the first film, there's the scene, the poker scene, right, where Paul Newman comes in and he really sort of humiliates Robert Shaw. He pretends to be rich and he gets under his skin completely. This idea that like high-class living can be completely simulated is interesting. And they really kind of double down on that particular element in the second film when Jackie Gleason goes to visit Carl Malden's club and really, really gets under his skin. This sort of new money kind of thing, or this, fitting into the high society environment is interesting. This is a particularly telling thing to have in a Depression era movie, sort of blurring the lines of the wealth. There's sort of a Robin Hood kind of element, I guess. I think one thing that I really liked about this thing when I saw it is that it's a story of people using their brains. It's a battle of wits. There's a certain escapism to this idea that the perfect plan can get you anywhere, almost a sort of meritocracy, right? We can get past these, undeserving criminals, the mobsters, who rule this town by outwitting them. Of course, you're also breaking the law. It is telling that all these plans involve gambling, which isn't usually thought of as an intellectual pursuit. There's an interesting scene in the original movie where Hooker visits a roulette wheel and loses a bunch of money. Again, pretty interesting contrast between his character and the hooker in the second movie. Robert Redford's character is much more nuanced. Much more nuanced. Anyway, we cut from sort of the gloomy underground establishment where Hooker was betting to a fancy casino where Lonergan passes his time. Gambling is somehow kind of egalitarian here. We see gambling underground in this, beaten down back room, and we also see a super fancy casino. I don't think there's an easy metaphor here, but the stuff does feel really salient when thinking about the Depression, the economy as this broken thing, or luck in the economy, things like that, or, you might be able to make something of yourself in America, but also it's a bit like roulette. I mean, it almost reminds you of the old Russian roulette in a movie like The Deer Hunter. That's kind of a weird comparison to make, but this idea that something is unfair, that something is broken, or that something is arbitrary, you can see how that would resonate with people in the Depression. Having said that, The Sting didn't come out during the Great Depression. It wasn't made during the Great Depression. It came out in another very fertile moment for America, not the age of Scott Joplin, but the age of Janis Joplin. Actually, I think Janis Joplin died in 1970, and Scott Joplin, I think this movie has done a lot to falsely associate ragtime music with the Great Depression. Scott Joplin, like I said, died in 1917. So really, forget what I just said. But anyway, another fertile moment for America. There was a lot going on in 1973, but this movie only has the subtlest traces of the counterculture in it, or of any of this political upheaval, really. I think the best I can do in that regard is to point out that the film positions prostitutes and the burlesque favorably. I don't mean that literally. Maybe you could say something about race as well. In the first movie, Luther is a compelling character. In the second movie, class and race are less prominent, although the grifters do work out of the back of a Chinese grocery. It's interesting that in both movies, Lonergan is a foreigner. The movies establish the conmen as being Americans, even though people doing this kind of con would almost certainly have been part of organized crime, just like the people they are trying to rip off. It's interesting that The Sting came out a year after The Godfather, but they're wildly different movies. Like I said, The Sting does a lot of work to establish the conmen as the good guys. They're not good guys. I mean, they are criminals, but the movie maybe wouldn't function. Interesting. I don't want to wander around too much here. I mean, I think I've poked at some interesting ideas, but this isn't the sort of movie with a lot of obvious conclusions. Like I said, it's interesting to see what comes to the surface between these two movies. There's a very particular view of Americana, the Sting world, or something like that, I want to close with one final thing, which is that The Sting is inherently linked to another movie, I think, which is Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. You probably see the connection. It's been a long time since I saw that movie, but as I recall, it was much more at home in 1969. In some ways, The Sting is a happier version of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, but it still has traces of ennui. The characters are a bit lost. I mentioned earlier that Robert Redford has far more nuance to him. There is a bit of roguish gallantry in the way he acts, but it's also sort of a melancholy thing. Both Hooker and Gondorff in the original are sort of unfulfilled, sort of lost. I mean, they have their highs and their lows, but in some ways, I mean, it's kind of a road movie or something. You know what I mean? they never exactly find their way home. It's telling that none of Jake's or none of Hooker's romantic enterprises ever really culminate. The Sting, too, is different. I'm not going to spoil the ending, but in many ways, it's similar to the ending of the first movie, sort of. Overall, though, it reads much more like a mobility story. The characters are not so much lost. They're more like happy-go-lucky, right? Maybe it's a subtle difference, but like I said, the second one reads much more like a mobility story, and it may or may not end with the creation of a family unit. You hate to see it. So that's maybe kind of a subtle difference, but I think it's actually pretty crucial to understanding where these two movies differ. Anyway, covered a lot of ground there. Like I said, The Sting is a great movie, an all-time great movie. Man, what a great movie. The Sting Part 2 is not terrible, like I said. It has some charisma. The acting is probably the best part. The plot is not terrible, but you can probably see it coming, and that really is not what you want for this sort of movie. You are almost certainly bound to be disappointed if you watch it, so I wouldn't really recommend it. But having said that, your expectations now might be low enough that you wouldn't be disappointed when you watch it. So I recommend it. Anyway, I'll see you next week.